Hey, it's Matt from Hidden Machine here again with another installment in our Remedy Connected Universe series. Now, as I've said before, this video is part of a longer video that was published back in 2021, which is a 3-hour long look and deep dive into the Remedy Connected Universe. This series attempts to take some of that same content and break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces so you can kind of check it out at your leisure. In today's video, we're going to start to look at the world of Alan Wake. Now, in our previous two videos, we looked at Max Payne 1 and Max Payne 2, and in each video, we broke down the plot, and then we looked at the themes and started to talk a bit about how they all relate both to the overall Remedy Connected Universe narrative, but also the meta-narratives that exist inside those games. Today, we're going to start to do something similar with Alan Wake, but we're going to break it down into chunks because this is where things start to get really dense. So Alan Wake, when it was first released, was preceded by a live-action web series called Bright Falls that's pretty much a prequel that leads directly into the opening moments of the game Alan Wake. So we're going to look at that show Bright Falls and talk a bit about that, and then I'm going to give you a plot summary of Alan Wake so you can get up to speed on everything before we dive into our next video, which will be a full analysis of the themes of Alan Wake. And we'll look at even more supplemental materials next time around, like some comics and books that were also released alongside Alan Wake that really work to expand both the story of Alan Wake and start to establish the connections that we'll see in games like Control. 9 years after the release of Alan Wake, this stuff was already the seeds were being planted, so to speak, all the way back in 2010 and 2012 when these ports and initial releases of Alan Wake were first released. So there's a lot to break down here, but today we're going to look at Bright Falls and then summarize the events of the game Alan Wake. Let's get into it. This game had a rather arduous development cycle, going from an open-world, mission-based game to the linear narrative that we eventually received. That whole process has been very well documented, and I'll leave a few links below this video if you want to learn more about that. One thing that's of particular interest regarding this topic is a book called Alan Wake Illuminated. Coming in at 176 pages, this hardcover book was included with the Prima official survival guide to Alan Wake. It covers the entire development cycle and gives in-depth explanations as to how the team arrived at a number of decisions concerning design, gameplay, and narrative. There's also a sizable section on cut content. I've seen this described online as an Alan Wake art book, but it really goes well beyond what I've seen offered in other video game related art books. You can check out our full 4K flip-through of the book to see more. Before the game was released, prospective players could go to the Xbox website and watch a 6-episode live-action web series called Bright Falls. Unlike the live-action adaptation of Max Payne, Remedy was very much involved in the creation of Bright Falls, and it shows. The series follows a journalist named Jake Fisher, who travels to the small town of Bright Falls, Washington, to interview Dr. Emil Hartman about his new book, titled The Creator's Dilemma. Jake hits a deer while driving into Bright Falls, and this seems to set off a disturbing series of events, wherein Jake finds himself waking up in all sorts of strange places, and losing large chunks of time in the process. While the series really only suggests what could be happening to Jake, it appears that a sort of dark presence is taking over his mind and body, causing him to black out and commit acts of violence. Jake tries to leave Bright Falls, but it doesn't seem like he was able to make it out intact. As the show draws to a close, we see Alan Wake and his wife Alice driving into Bright Falls themselves, thus giving a perfect segue into the opening of the game. The show introduced several characters that players would eventually meet in the game, and it did a surprisingly good job of capturing the overall look and atmosphere of Alan Wake. An interview with the director, Philip Van, says that Remedy was involved throughout the process and had final approval on all of the work being done. This shift into using live-action scenes to tell a story would be present in all Remedy games going forward. It's another example of the studio adding something to its repertoire and continuing to hone and refine it over time. The story of Alan Wake is as twisting and satisfying as the saga of Max Payne, but whereas Max Payne told the majority of its narrative through the graphic novel cutscenes, Alan Wake tells its story through a number of different devices. The game is split into two main types of levels, usually separated by day and night. Daytime scenarios generally present exposition, and nighttime scenarios focus more on combat and exploration. This sort of clear distinction between gameplay modes is another thing we'll see in other Remedy titles going forward. Alan Wake is an everyman, not an action hero like Max Payne. He has a modest arsenal of weapons available to him throughout the game, but doesn't utilize any special combat abilities like bullet time. While enemy encounters aren't always scripted, there's always a clear shift into a combat scenario, and a clear end to a combat scenario, which is signaled by the slow motion death animation of the final enemy in a battle, a visual element adapted from Max Payne. But enough about the form, let's discuss the actual content of Alan Wake. The game tells the story of Alan Wake, a famous author who lives in New York City with his wife Alice. Alan is best known for a series of crime thrillers starring the detective Alex Casey. Alan wrote 6 Alex Casey novels, titled Alex Casey, What I Can't Forget, Return to Sender, The Things That I Want, The Fall of Casey, and The Sudden Stop. Alan surprised his fans by killing off Alex Casey in The Sudden Stop, and claimed that he wanted to take his writing in a different direction. However, 2 years pass and Alan is unable to write anything at all. In an attempt to help Alan through his writer's block, Alice Wake sets up a trip to Bright Falls. Alan is looking forward to just getting away for a while, but unbeknownst to him, Alice has brought along a typewriter and has been in touch with Dr. Emil Hartman, author of The Creator's Dilemma and owner of the Cauldron Lake Lodge, a sort of mental health facility that caters to artists. She hopes to connect Alan with Dr. Hartman. As we learn throughout the story, Alan's issues go well beyond writer's block. We find that Alan has been battling alcoholism and has been prone to violent outbursts, having caught several battery charges, but avoiding any serious jail time. When Alan sees that Alice brought along a typewriter, he becomes enraged. He storms out of the cabin that the couple has rented for their trip, but rushes back in once he hears Alice screaming for help. He enters the cabin too late, finding that Alice has fallen from a balcony into Cauldron Lake. Alan dives in after her, but is unable to find his wife. A mysterious woman in black guides Alan back into the cabin and sits him down at the typewriter. Like a man possessed, he begins to write a manuscript for a novel called Departure. As he writes, he's guided by the woman in black, and over time, the words become less and less like his own and more like hers, but he struggles to stop writing. The manuscript begins to become a horror story. In a moment of lucidity, Alan breaks free from the typewriter and rushes to his car. He tries to drive away, but crashes the vehicle and wakes up with no memory of the previous week spent inside of the cabin. He heads for the closest lights that he can see, coming from the nearby Stuckey's gas station. He makes his way through the woods. Along the way, he begins to find scattered pages from the Departure manuscript. He isn't sure what to make of it. He recognizes the writing as his own, but still has no memory of typing those words. When he finally makes it to the gas station, he is met by Sheriff Sarah Breaker. Breaker can see that Alan has clearly suffered some severe physical trauma, and she brings him into the station to get checked out by a local doctor. Sheriff Breaker also wants to question him about the gas station because it turns out that its owner, Carl Stuckey, has gone missing. Before the sheriff can really speak to Alan, he gets a phone call from a man who claims to have kidnapped his wife Alice. He tells Alan to meet him at Lover's Peak later that night and to bring his new manuscript with him to exchange for Alice. Alan decides to not let the police know about the call from the kidnapper and is soon picked up at the station by his agent, Barry Wheeler. Alan explains the kidnapping to Barry and also claims that he was attacked the previous night by Carl Stuckey. However, Stuckey appeared to him wrapped in shadows and was a raving, maniacal version of his former self. Alan used a flashlight to weaken Stuckey before shooting him, only to have Stuckey's corpse vanish into thin air, as if he had never really been there at all. Barry obviously doesn't know what to make of all of this, but he and Alan have a very close bond, and maybe even more than that, Alan's writing is an extremely valuable asset to Barry. The idea of a new manuscript after 2 years of writer's block helps to keep Barry from totally disregarding Alan's story. Alan heads into the forest after dark, making his way toward Lover's Peak to meet the kidnapper. In the forest, Alan is attacked by more men covered in shadow, and is forced to defend himself, but upon their deaths, these men too disappear, just like Stucky. Alan can't be sure if he's become a murderer or if these men are just hallucinations. He eventually meets the kidnapper, who doesn't have Alice with him, but Alan doesn't have the manuscript either. He tells the kidnapper that he needs more time to finish it. The kidnapper gives Alan 2 days to get the manuscript together. Over the next 2 days, Alan struggles to find the remaining pages of the manuscript, to no avail. When he finally meets the kidnapper again, the kidnapper confesses that he never actually had Alice, and was simply trying to get Wake to cooperate. Before he's able to learn more, a dark presence taking the form of a tornado violently pulls the kidnapper away. And this is seemingly the same dark presence fueling the shadow-clad attackers. Wake too is caught in the shadowy vortex and is tossed into a nearby body of water, where he again blacks out, only to wake up inside of Cauldron Lake Lodge. When he comes to, Alan is unexpectedly face to face with the lodge's owner, Dr. Emil Hartman. Hartman explains to Wake that Alice died that night at the cabin when she fell from the balcony, and that the trauma of the event has caused Alan to fall into a series of delusional episodes linked together by bouts of memory loss. Hartman believes that, as a creative individual, writing will be an essential part of Alan's recovery, and he urges Alan to get back to his typewriter as soon as possible. Alan is obviously suspicious, but is unable to entirely make sense of everything that he's been experiencing. He soon runs into 2 patients of the lodge, Tor and Odin Anderson. Decades prior, the Anderson brothers played together in a rock band called the Old Gods of Asgard. The brothers own a now abandoned property, a large farm that's complete with, among other things, a distillery, outdoor concert area, and a lovely farmhouse. They tell Alan that there's a message for him at the farm. They also present Alan with one of the manuscript pages. Alan isn't totally sure what to think of the brothers, but he does sense some sort of connection to them. That night, a power outage hits the lodge, and Alan sees a chance to escape. Patients begin to attack the staff at the lodge, and Hartman is nowhere to be found. Alan decides to snoop around the lodge before leaving, and discovers that Hartman was behind the fake kidnapping plot. He also finds that Hartman had detained Barry Wheeler. Alan realizes that Emil Hartman is more sinister than he could have ever guessed, and eventually finds his way into Hartman's office, where Hartman is hiding out. Held at gunpoint, Hartman comes clean about his plans. He urges Alan to work with him, claiming that they can create something powerful together, when suddenly, the dark presence whisks him away. Alan and Barry are now fully aware of the dark presence and its ability to not only corrupt people, but also to manipulate objects, creating all manner of obstacles and threats to their escape from the lodge. They are able to make it out alive and head toward the Anderson farm, in pursuit of the only lead that they have left at the moment. When they eventually make it to the Andersons' farmhouse, they discover an Old Gods of Asgard record. It seems to Alan that this record contains the message that the Anderson brothers were referring to. The record tells Alan that he needs to seek the Lady of the Light. Alan is suddenly reminded of a woman that he saw around town named Cynthia Weaver. Cynthia carried a lantern in her arms and was fixated on lights and shadows. Locals wrote her off as a somewhat senile eccentric, but given the circumstances, Alan believes that she could be the key to defeating the Dark Presence. A concept that Alan struggles to understand throughout much of the game is the true nature of the manuscript pages. The events depicted in the pages appear to be predictions that come true soon after Alan reads them, as if all of these bizarre happenings in the game were somehow a direct product of Alan's lost week inside of the cabin. Alan and Barry decide to spend the night in the farmhouse, and as he sleeps, Alan has a vivid dream that depicts that lost week, and he is finally able to remember his time writing the manuscript. This newly discovered context, along with his mission to find Cynthia Weaver, reinvigorates Alan. However, he wasn't the only person finding these manuscript pages.
For it is said on moonless nights they may still haunt this place.
FBI agent Robert Nightingale and his partner, Agent Finn, were known around the Bureau as the Righteous Brothers. The two never broke a rule, never had a drink, and they had a very strong friendship. But over time, Agent Finn seemed to break down. He became very afraid of shadows and kept talking about the darkness. Agent Finn eventually disappeared, sending his partner into a severe downward spiral. Agent Nightingale became obsessed with understanding this darkness that took over his partner's mind. He became dependent on alcohol, and was so singularly focused on the darkness that he wound up losing his job. Undeterred, Nightingale continued to pose as a federal agent, and his investigation eventually brought him to Bright Falls, and in turn, to Alan Wake. While on the hunt, Nightingale was also finding these manuscript pages, and was seeing the effect that they were having on the world around him. He saw Alan Wake as the architect of the darkness, and as such, responsible for the disappearance and likely death of his partner. When Alan woke up from his dream in the farmhouse, he found himself being held at gunpoint by Nightingale. Alan and Barry were then brought to the local police station, where Nightingale and Breaker argued over what to do with them. Before the situation had a chance to escalate, the Dark Presence again interrupted, this time taking Agent Nightingale. Somewhat bizarrely, Sheriff Breaker didn't seem entirely shocked by this turn of events, and immediately trusted Alan, agreeing to help him and Barry reach Cynthia Weaver. The trio take off and, after much trial and tribulation, eventually reach their destination, Bright Falls Light and Power. This power plant has become a sort of home base for Cynthia Weaver. When Cynthia was a young woman, she had an immense unrequited love for a poet named Thomas Zane. Thomas was an avid diver and lived in a cabin on Cauldron Lake. He spent a lot of time there with his muse and lover, Barbara Jagger, as well as his young assistant, Emil Hartman. One day, Barbara was diving in the lake and drowned. Thomas tried to go in after her, but failed to find her. Distraught, Thomas was encouraged by Emil Hartman to attempt to write her back into reality. To Tom's delight, Emil's plan worked. Barbara returned, but she wasn't the same as before. She had become possessed by the Dark Presence. A desperate Thomas Zane tied the possessed corpse of his former lover to a chair and cut out her heart, but she would not die. Ultimately, Thomas decided to sacrifice himself to destroy this evil version of Barbara. He put on his diving suit and sent himself and Barbara to the bottom of Cauldron Lake. However, before doing so, he entrusted Cynthia Weaver with a shoebox. Thomas Zane knew that when he dove into the lake for the last time, he and his legacy would essentially be erased from reality. He used the same powers that resurrected Barbara to create a rule stating that whatever was left in a shoebox would not be erased from reality. He knew that Cynthia was hopelessly devoted to him, and, in a way, he took advantage of those feelings when leaving the shoebox with her. Within that shoebox was an ordinary-looking old light switch, the kind that would make a distinct clicking sound when pressed. This clicker would act as a sort of safety mechanism in the event that the Dark Presence that had possessed Barbara Jagger were to ever return to reality, and that's exactly what happened when Alan Wake arrived in Bright Falls. Cynthia kept the clicker hidden in a place called the Well-Lit Room, a room that didn't allow for any significant shadows to exist, no places for the Dark Presence to creep in. With the clicker in hand, Alan departed for Cauldron Lake for a final confrontation with Barbara Jagger. When he finally reached her, he shoved the clicker into the hole where her heart once was, and activated it, which exploded Barbara Jagger and seemingly freed Bright Falls from the power of the Dark Presence. As the game comes to a close, we can see Alice safely emerging from Cauldron Lake. However, Alan is now stuck in a supernatural location called the Dark Place. Cauldron Lake is a sort of gateway into the Dark Place. The laws of the Dark Place allow for true acts of creativity committed within it to have a direct but often unpredictable effect on our reality. Now that Alice is safe, Alan has tasked himself with finding a way to write himself back into reality and reunite with her.